this issue with Vice President Harris and what she had to say. I was fascinated and frankly, pleased this morning watching part of the Joe Scarborough show, the Morning Joe show on MSNBC. I was just catching it as I was getting up, and it was about, they played this clip of Vice President Harris in Dubai saying that we're here for a two-state solution. Now this is, last week Netanyahu said, no way, it's not going to happen as long as I'm prime minister. And, which means that, well, I guess it's fairly obvious what it means. It's not a good thing. And this is what she said. I'll just quote from her speech. She said, I've had a number of conversations with Arab leaders here in Dubai. The international, and by the way, she met with the president of Egypt. She met with the king of Jordan. She's met with a bunch of, high-level Arab leaders there. She says the international community must dedicate significant resources to support short and long-term recovery in Gaza, number one. So, we want to rebuild. Which, now you've got some of the hard right in Israel, not Netanyahu explicitly, but some of his supporters who are basically saying, kick them all out, take the land. I don't know where you're going to kick them to, but, so anyhow, she's coming down strongly against that, number one. Number two, she says the Palestinian Authority's security forces must be, in other words, the internal police run by the Palestinian Authority. Now, the Palestinian Authority does not control Gaza. They control the West Bank. And these are quite separate. Gaza is like, if Israel was the continental United States, obviously there's a difference in size, but if it was, Gaza would be California and the West Bank would be New England. I mean, that's how far apart they are. They're literally on opposite sides of the country. It's not that great a distance. You can drive it in a day, but that's what you've got there. And the Palestinian Authority does have its own, police, and they have been maintaining peace. And in fact, the biggest issue that I'm seeing in the news anyway, in the East Bank is the settler movement. These hardcore right-wing Israelis who are claiming that God gave the entire land of Israel to Jews back 3,000 years ago, and the Palestinians are there entirely illegitimately, and they're just basically taking people's houses, destroying people's houses, provoking conflict. And so, she's saying no to that. She says, this is the second thing she said, the Palestinian Authority security forces must be strengthened to eventually assume security responsibilities in Gaza. Until then, there must be security arrangements that are acceptable to Israel, the people of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, and the international partners. Again, very much not what Netanyahu is saying, but what a lot of people in Israel are saying. And then she goes on, her third point, the Palestinian Authority must be revitalized. Now, it has become basically a gerontocracy, and it's been a very corrupt gerontocracy for a long time. Yasser Arafat himself, for all his youthful victories and idealism, basically became a very, very wealthy man in his old age and set the tone. I mean, it reminds me in a way of the American unions back in the 1960s, when Jimmy Hoffa was stealing money from the UAW, or the Teamsters rather, and using it to invest in the Sun Valley land deal down in Florida that Bobby Kennedy busted him for. And the reason why Hoffa took a suitcase with $1 million to a meeting with Carlos Marcello and Santo Traficante and Traficante's lawyer, Traficante's lawyer, who was at the meeting and on the record told me and Lamar about this meeting. And it's not a secret now. He wrote a book actually later, about a year after we interviewed him. But he said that Jimmy Hoffa brought that money and said, I'll give you $1 million if you'll assassinate Bobby Kennedy, because Bobby Kennedy was coming after him for that. And of course, Marcello famously said, or Traficante famously said, if you cut off a dog's tail, it'll just turn around and bite you. If you cut off its head, it's finished. In other words, let's kill Jack instead of Bobby. But I digress. My point is that back then you had a lot of corruption in the unions in the United States, or at least some of the larger unions, and it didn't serve them well. It didn't serve the movement well. And that corruption has been flushed out now over the past 40 years. And you've got some real heroes as heroes of the union movement, Sean Fain being at the top of the list, the United Auto Workers. And I'm hopeful that the Palestinian Authority can follow a similar path on the West Bank and be empowered to take over Gaza as well. But they're not going to be able to do it without our help and without the help of the world community. And so that's what Vice President Harris is talking about here when she says, and third, in fact, I haven't finished the sentence. She says the third point is the Palestinian Authority must be revitalized, driven by the will of the Palestinian people, which will allow them to benefit from the rule of law and a transparent, responsive government. Now, first of all, this is the first COP meeting, I believe, or one of the first COP meetings, one of the few COP meetings that a president of the United States has not gone to. Instead, he sent Kamala Harris. I think that's a good thing. I want to see more of Kamala Harris on the world stage. We know Joe Biden, we know his opinions, he does a fine job. I want to see him out, a lot too. We can chew gum and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But I particularly want to see more of her because you and I both know that starting probably in the summer of next year and certainly in the fall, the thing, and capital T's in both words, the thing that the Republicans have in their back pocket that they are going to pull out in the last 3 months of the election, maybe the last 6 months of the election, maybe even the last couple of 2 months, like the Willie Horton ads did. This is how George Herbert Walker Bush's campaign, Lee Atwater's advice, did it with the Willie Horton ads back in the election of 1992. Pull this stuff out at the last minute. Michael Dukakis thought nobody's going to take that stuff seriously. That was a program that was started by the Republican governor before me. Everybody knows that. And so he didn't say anything, and Bush ate his lunch. So what they're going to pull out of their pocket at the last minute, their version of the Willie Horton ad will be, hey, instead of saying, hey, have you noticed that this candidate let a black guy out of jail? It's going to be, hey, have you noticed that this candidate, Joe Biden, has a black woman as his vice president? They're not going to campaign against Biden. They're going to campaign against Kamala Harris. And I talked about this back in June. It was the last time I wrote about this. And I stand behind it. In fact, I'm more convinced than ever of the importance of it. Nikki Haley has just in the last little bit come out and said, if you're voting for Biden, you're voting for Kamala Harris for president. One of the right-wing groups recently has come out with some very strong statements to this effect. One of the Republican politicians, and forgive me for not remembering which, it was a week or two ago, but one of the guys in one of the high-profile Republicans in the House, and I'm talking about the MAGA crazies. In response to a question about the Biden administration, referenced Kamala Harris rather than Joe Biden. I mean, they're already starting. They're clearly getting ready. They understand messaging. And their message is going to be, have you noticed that she's a black woman? Have you noticed that she has South Asian ancestry, that she's actually mixed race? Have you noticed that well, that's going to be the focus of it, frankly. I mean, racism, as our regular caller Ron Kenyatta talks about in his newsletter over on Substack, which is really worth following. Anti-black racism in this country is so deep, is so strong. It is every bit as built into our DNA as are any of the highfalutin phrases in the Declaration of Independence or in our Constitution. And that is going to be the secret weapon, and I put that in scare quotes, that the Republicans are going to be rolling out against the Biden-Harris ticket. They didn't do it so much in 2020 rather. I mean, certainly it was happening in the Facebook posts and things like that, but it wasn't quite as explicit. It's going to get explicit. And this is the problem, is that right now most Americans don't know Kamala Harris. I mean, people from California know her. They know her as the senator from California. They know her as the attorney general for the state. They know her history in the state and in the cities. But most Americans don't have any idea who she is. And this was the problem that John Kerry had in 2004 when he ran against George W. Bush. He had he didn't have a national profile. It's the opposite of the situation that Herbert Walker Bush had. He was fairly well known. He was, the Bush dynasty. His father had been a senator, Prescott Bush. He had been in Congress. He'd worked for the CIA. He'd been our trade envoy to China. He was a high-profile guy. Kamala Harris has been low profile. It's the opposite of the problem that George W. Bush had. He was the son of the former president. It's the opposite of the problem or the situation. It's not a problem, the benefit, really, that Trump had. Everybody in America knew who Donald Trump was. NBC had spent millions, tens of millions of dollars, not just teaching him how to be a reality TV star, which they did. They hired coaches to train him, but making him a reality TV star. Well, nobody's done that for Kamala Harris either. And I guarantee you that when Trump picks a vice presidential candidate, and I'm assuming he's going to be the nominee, I realize it may be a wrong assumption, but I think we have to operate on this assumption right now. It's going to be somebody who is also well-known. I don't think he's going to pick a Mike Pence. I don't think he's going to pick a quiet, obscure backbencher. He picked Mike Pence because he needed the religious vote. He doesn't need the religious vote anymore. He has it. They are in his pocket. They know that he will do whatever he has to do to promote right-wing Christian nationalism in the United States. He doesn't need, the white racist vote. They're never going to leave him. He could put a black person on the ticket with him. He could put Tim Scott on the ticket with him, and he would not lose the white racist vote. And so, he's going to find somebody who's high profile. Kamala Harris needs to become high profile. If she doesn't, they're going to swift boat her. They're going to say, oh, let us tell you about her. They're going to do to her what they did to John Kerry. They're going to do to her what they did at the last minute to Michael Dukakis. Relatively unknowns. She has to become a known. And I think that this is the beginning of that process, and I think it's a good thing. And I was impressed by your speech as well. Love to hear your thoughts on it. I'll be right back.